Imagine possessing a power so profound that it would fundamentally alter your relationship with reality itself. Picture yourself standing at the center of a crowded city street, surrounded by the chaos of modern life, people rushing to appointments, cars streaming past, the world moving at its relentless pace. Now imagine that with a simple thought, you could bring all of this to a complete stop. The pedestrians would freeze mid-stride, their feet suspended above the pavement. The cars would hang motionless in the flow of traffic. Even the pigeons would become statues in the sky, wings spread but perfectly still. The rain, if it were falling, would transform into a gallery of suspended droplets, each one catching the light like a diamond frozen in the air. This is not science fiction. This is the thought experiment we are about to explore together. What would happen if you possessed the ability to control time itself? The concept of controlling time has captivated human imagination for thousands of years. Ancient myths spoke of gods who could manipulate the flow of events, who could see the future and change the past, who existed outside the normal constraints of temporal progression. Philosophers have pondered the nature of time for millennia, asking whether it truly flows like a river or whether it is merely an illusion created by our consciousness. Scientists have discovered that time is far stranger than our everyday experience suggests, that it can speed up and slow down, that it is intimately connected to space and gravity, and that it may not even be as fundamental as we once believed. But what we are contemplating tonight goes beyond mere observation of time's strange properties. We are imagining what it would mean to have absolute control over time, to pause it, rewind it, fast forward through it, or even step outside of it entirely. This power would make you perhaps the most powerful being in the universe, capable of accomplishments that would seem like pure magic to everyone else. You could save lives by pausing time at the moment of disaster. You could learn everything there is to know by freezing the world and studying for what would seem like years to you but would be merely an instant for everyone else. You could travel the world without losing a second of your normal life. You could undo mistakes by rewinding time and choosing different paths. The implications are staggering, touching on everything from physics and neuroscience to ethics and philosophy. To understand what it would mean to control time, we must first grapple with what time actually is. This question has puzzled the greatest minds in human history and continues to challenge our understanding today. In our everyday experience, time seems simple enough. It flows steadily from past to future, carrying us along like a river. Events happen in sequence, one after another. Causes precede their effects. We remember the past but not the future. We age continuously in one direction. These observations seem so obvious and universal that we rarely question them. But when we examine time more closely, using the tools of modern physics and philosophy, we discover that this simple picture is profoundly incomplete. Time is not the steady, universal river we imagine it to be. Instead, it is a dimension that can be stretched and compressed, a property that emerges from deeper physical processes, and possibly even an illusion created by the peculiar way our brains process information about the world. Albert Einstein revolutionized our understanding of time in the early 20th century by showing that time is relative, not absolute. Different observers moving at different speeds experience time flowing at different rates. Someone traveling at high velocity ages more slowly than someone standing still. Someone deep in a gravitational field experiences time passing more slowly than someone far from any massive objects. These are not mere theoretical curiosities, but measurable effects that have been confirmed by countless experiments. Atomic clocks flown on airplanes show measurably different times than identical clocks left on the ground. The global positioning system must account for these time dilation effects, or it would be useless for navigation. Particles created in high-energy collisions live longer than they should because time slows down for them due to their high velocities. Einstein's theories revealed that space and time are not separate entities but are woven together into a single four-dimensional fabric called space-time. Events do not happen in space and then in time, but rather they occur at specific locations in space-time. The distinction between past, present, and future may be more fluid than we realize. What we call the present moment is really just the collection of events that are happening at a particular slice through space-time, and different observers moving at different speeds will disagree about which events are simultaneous. This relativity of simultaneity suggests that in some deep sense, all moments of time may exist equally, spread out across the space-time landscape, like cities along a highway. If this is true, then the flow of time that we experience so vividly might be an illusion, a trick of consciousness that makes us feel like we are moving through time, when in fact, all moments simply exist in an eternal now. Quantum mechanics adds another layer of mystery to our understanding of time. At the quantum level, particles do not follow definite paths through space and time, but exist in superpositions of multiple possible states. Only when we measure them do they collapse into specific locations and moments. This suggests that the future may not be determined, but rather exists as a cloud of possibilities that crystallize into actuality only when observed. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics go even further, suggesting that every possible outcome of every quantum measurement actually occurs in a branching multiverse of parallel timelines. If this is correct, then time does not flow along a single track but splits and diverges like an infinitely branching tree, with every decision and every quantum event creating new timeline branches. Even more radically, some physicists have proposed that time may not be fundamental at all, but might emerge from more basic physical processes. Just as temperature emerges from the random motions of molecules, time might emerge from deeper quantum processes. At the most fundamental level, the universe might be timeless, with the flow of time being a secondary phenomenon that only appears at larger scales. These scientific insights into the nature of time have profound implications for our thought experiment about controlling time. If time is relative, then controlling it might mean different things for different observers. If time is emergent, then controlling it might require manipulating the underlying quantum processes from which it arises. If all moments of time exist equally in a timeless space-time, then controlling time might mean learning to navigate freely through this landscape rather than being confined to a single path from past to future. Let us begin our exploration by considering the simplest form of time control, the ability to pause time completely. Imagine you are sitting in a cafe, watching the world go by through the window. People walk past, birds fly overhead, cars drive down the street. Now imagine that you possess the ability to freeze all of this with a thought. You concentrate, and suddenly, everything stops. The person walking past the window is frozen mid-step. The bird overhead hangs motionless in the air. The car on the street is suspended in space. Even the steam rising from your coffee cup has solidified into a static sculpture of vapor. The entire world has become a three-dimensional photograph, perfectly still and silent. What would this experience be like? The first thing you might notice is the profound silence. Without the movement of air, there would be no sound. The rustling of leaves, the hum of traffic, the murmur of conversation, all would cease instantly. You would exist in a world of absolute quiet, where the only sounds would be those you create yourself, your breathing, your footsteps, your heartbeat. The silence would be so complete that it might become oppressive, a reminder of how isolated you have become from the normal flow of events. But the silence would be only the beginning of the strangeness. As you stood up from your table and began to explore this frozen world, you would encounter phenomena that challenge everything you know about physics and reality. The air itself would have stopped moving, which would make breathing impossible in the normal sense. Each breath would require you to push through stationary air molecules, creating a vacuum behind you as you moved. You might need to be exempt from the time, freeze yourself to function, creating a bubble of normal time around your body while everything else remained frozen. As you walked through the frozen street, you would notice that light behaves strangely in a world without time. If time has truly stopped, then photons would be frozen in space, unable to travel from objects to your eyes. The world should be completely dark because light requires time to propagate. To see anything, you would need to move through the frozen photons, gathering them with your eyes as you walk. The visual experience would be profoundly altered, perhaps resembling moving through a three-dimensional photograph, where the scene only becomes visible as you intersect with the light rays that were in flight when time stopped. The frozen people you encounter would present an eerie sight. They would not be like statues of stone, but would maintain all the properties of living tissue, warmth, softness, the subtle variations in skin tone. Their eyes would be open or closed, depending on where they were, in their blink cycle when time stopped. Their expressions would be caught mid-emotion, smiles half-formed, frowns not quite complete. Looking into their frozen eyes would be like gazing into the windows of empty houses. The consciousness that normally animates these bodies would be suspended, neither present nor absent, but simply paused. You could walk among them, study them, even touch them gently, and they would never know you were there. You could walk right up to someone and look closely at their face, seeing details you would never normally observe. The tiny wrinkles around their eyes, the subtle variations in their iris patterns, the individual hairs of their eyebrows. In frozen time, you could study people with the intensity usually reserved for portrait paintings, except these subjects would be real human beings suspended in the flow of their lives. The ethical implications of this power would be immediate and profound. With everyone frozen, you could access any location, open any door, read any document. You would have complete freedom to explore spaces that are normally restricted or private. You could walk through a museum after hours and stand inches from priceless artworks. You could enter government buildings and read classified documents. You could access bank vaults, research laboratories, or private homes. No lock could keep you out because you would have infinite time to find keys or bypass security systems. This unlimited access would come with unlimited temptation. You could take things that do not belong to you and no one would ever know. You could read people's private messages and learn their deepest secrets. You could observe moments meant to be private. The power to pause time would effectively grant you invisibility and invulnerability, a combination that would test the moral character of even the most ethical person. But let us assume you resist these temptations and instead use your power for more benign purposes. You could use frozen time for learning and self-improvement. Imagine pausing time whenever you encounter something difficult or challenging, giving yourself hours or days to study and practice while no time passes in the outside world. You could become an expert in any field by freezing time and accessing libraries, laboratories, or workshops where you could teach yourself at your own pace. A medical student could pause time during a difficult surgery, giving themselves time to consult textbooks, study the anatomy, and plan their approach before resuming time and executing the procedure perfectly. An artist could freeze time in front of a landscape and spend days capturing every detail in their painting. A musician could pause time during a performance, giving themselves time to practice difficult passages until they are perfect. In each case, what appears to others as natural talent or genius would actually be the result of countless hours of practice compressed into instants of frozen time. You could use this power to save lives in emergency situations. Imagine witnessing a car accident. You could freeze time at the moment of impact, giving yourself time to pull people from damaged vehicles, administer first aid, or even reposition cars to prevent the worst of the collision. To everyone else, it would seem like a miracle. People would walk away from accidents that should have been fatal, rescued by forces they could not see or understand. You could prevent crimes by freezing time when you witness them about to occur. You could pause time and disarm a would-be attacker, move potential victims out of danger, or alert authorities. You would become an invisible guardian, preventing harm through interventions that leave no trace. But the power to pause time would also reveal aspects of reality that most people never consider. With the world frozen, you could observe the normally invisible processes that underlie everyday events. You could watch as a flame freezes mid-flicker, see the exact pattern of ripples on a pond stopped in time, or observe the precise arrangement of raindrops suspended in the air. These frozen moments would be like windows into the hidden structure of nature, revealing patterns and relationships that are normally obscured by motion and change. You might discover that pausing time gives you a different perspective on cause and effect. In normal time, we see effects following causes in sequence. A person pushes a door, and it opens. A stone drops into water, and ripples spread outward. But in frozen time, you could observe the entire causal chain laid out simultaneously. You could see the door already beginning to swing open before the person's hand has finished its pushing motion, because in the frozen moment, all parts of the causal process exist together. This might give you insights into the nature of causality itself, revealing it not as a sequence of discrete events, but as a unified structure that extends across time. The experience of pausing time might also change your relationship with your own consciousness. If you spend hours or days in frozen time while only seconds pass in the normal world, you would accumulate subjective experience at a rate far exceeding normal human life. You could live years of subjective time while your body ages only days. This would make you ancient in experience while still young in biological years. You might become wise beyond your years, having had time to contemplate and reflect that no other human has ever possessed. But this accelerated subjective experience might also be isolating. After spending months in frozen time while everyone else experiences only a day, you might find it difficult to relate to people who have not shared your experiences. You would have memories of times that never happened for anyone else, of wandering through a frozen world that existed only for you. This might create a sense of loneliness or alienation, a feeling of being disconnected from the normal flow of human experience. The practical aspects of living in frozen time would present interesting challenges. You would need to eat and drink, but with time frozen, how would you prepare food? Stoves would not work because fire requires time to burn. Microwaves would not function because electromagnetic radiation requires time to propagate. You might need to eat only foods that require no preparation, or you might discover that your bubble of normal time extends far enough to allow you to use basic appliances. Water would present similar challenges. In frozen time, water would not flow from faucets or fountains. You might need to physically gather water molecules and compress them into drinkable form, or your personal time bubble might extend to include water systems, allowing them to function normally while the rest of the world remains frozen. Sleep would become optional in frozen time. You could pause time whenever you felt tired, sleep for 8 hours in your own time bubble, and wake up refreshed while no time has passed in the outside world. This would effectively eliminate the need for sleep in normal time, giving you access to 24 hours of active time every day. Over a normal human lifespan, this would add decades of waking experience. As you explore the frozen world, you might begin to notice subtle changes that suggest time is not as completely frozen as you thought. Perhaps you observe that frozen people gradually shift position over what seems to you like hours of frozen time, as if they are moving in extreme slow motion rather than being completely stopped. This would suggest that your time control is not absolute but rather creates a massive time dilation, where you experience time at a rate billions of times faster than everyone else. This slow-motion world would be mesmerizing to watch. You could observe a hummingbird's wings moving frame by frame, see the exact sequence of muscle contractions as a person walks, or watch as sound waves propagate through the air at a crawl. The normally invisible processes of the everyday world would become visible and observable, transformed from blur and motion into a detailed sequence that you could study at your leisure. You might discover that you can adjust the degree of time slowdown, creating a gradient of time rates. You could slow time just enough to make everyone move in slow motion, giving you a speed advantage without completely freezing the world. Or you could create pockets of normal time within the frozen world, allowing specific objects or people to move at normal speed while everything else remains frozen. This selective time control would open up even more possibilities and raise even more questions. The physics of a paused world would be fascinating to contemplate. If time is truly stopped, then the laws of thermodynamics would cease to operate. Heat would not flow, entropy would not increase, and the arrow of time that normally points from past to future would disappear. The universe would exist in a state of perfect stasis, unchanging and eternal. But this raises a paradox. If time is truly stopped, how can you move and think? Movement requires time, as does thought. The very act of pausing time seems to require that time continues for you even as it stops for everything else. This suggests that perfect time stopping might be impossible, and what you are really doing is creating a massive differential in time rates, where you experience time at a normal rate, while the rest of the universe experiences it at an infinitesimally slow rate. Now let us expand our exploration to consider a more complex form of time control, the ability to rewind time and undo events. Imagine that you have just witnessed something you wish you could change. Perhaps you said something hurtful to a friend, or you missed an important opportunity, or you made a decision that led to negative consequences. With the power to rewind time, you could simply turn back the clock, returning to a point before the unwanted event occurred, and make different choices. The ability to rewind time would be like having an undo button for reality itself. You could experiment with different approaches to problems, trying various solutions, and rewinding when they do not work out. You could explore different conversation paths, different career choices, different relationship decisions, all without suffering permanent consequences from your mistakes. Every error would become a learning opportunity. Every failure would be temporary and reversible. But rewinding time raises profound questions about consciousness and memory. When you rewind time, do you retain your memories of what happened in the rewound timeline? If you do, then you would accumulate memories of events that never happened, or rather, events that were erased and replaced with different outcomes. After using rewind many times, your memory would be filled with multiple versions of the same events, parallel histories that all feel equally real because you experienced them all. This multiplicity of memories might become confusing or overwhelming. You might struggle to remember which timeline is the current one, which version of events actually happened versus which ones you rewound and erased. You might have memories of conversations that never occurred, relationships that never developed, or experiences that were erased from reality but not from your mind. This would create a fundamental disconnect between your subjective experience and objective reality. The ethics of rewinding time become complicated when we consider how it affects other people. When you rewind time, you erase not just your own experiences but everyone else's as well. The conversations they had, the choices they made, the experiences they accumulated, all would be undone without their knowledge or consent. In effect, you would be repeatedly destroying and recreating the universe, replacing one timeline with another, based solely on your preferences and desires. Consider a specific scenario. You have a conversation with a friend that goes badly, leading to an argument. You rewind time to before the conversation and try a different approach. This time, the conversation goes well and your friendship is strengthened. From your friend's perspective, they never experience the argument at all. Their memory contains only the positive conversation. But you remember both timelines, the argument that you erased and the pleasant conversation that replaced it. You have taken away an experience from your friend without them ever knowing it existed. Is this ethical? You have improved the outcome for both of you, but you have also violated your friend's autonomy by manipulating their reality without consent. Some might argue that this is benign or even beneficial since the erased timeline no longer exists. No harm was done in the current timeline, and both you and your friend are better off. But others might contend that you have played God with someone else's life, making decisions about what experiences they should and should not have based on your own judgment. The implications become even more troubling when we consider larger-scale uses of rewind. Imagine you witness a crime and rewind time to prevent it. The would-be criminal never commits the crime in the new timeline and so is not guilty of anything, but you know what they were going to do. You have memories of them committing an act that, in the current timeline, never occurred. Do you have the right to judge them for an action they did not take, even though you remember them taking it in an erased timeline? This raises questions about the nature of moral responsibility. Are we responsible for actions we took in timelines that no longer exist? If you rewind time after doing something wrong, have you truly undone the wrong, or have you simply hidden it? From an external perspective, you never did anything wrong in the current timeline. But from your own perspective, you remember doing it. Does that memory carry moral weight? The ability to rewind time could lead to a kind of moral complacency. If you can always undo your mistakes, you might become less careful about avoiding them in the first place. Why worry about the consequences of your actions when you can simply rewind if things go badly? This could lead to a degradation of moral character, where you become increasingly reckless and selfish because you know you can always erase the negative outcomes. Alternatively, the power to rewind could make you more ethical and thoughtful. Knowing that you can see the consequences of different choices might lead you to experiment until you find the most ethical path forward. You could use rewind to maximize positive outcomes for everyone, not just yourself, creating a timeline where the most people benefit the most. In this sense, rewind could be a tool for consequentialist ethics, allowing you to literally test different actions and choose the one with the best results. The physics of rewinding time is even more mysterious than the physics of pausing it. When you rewind time, you are not just stopping time, but actually reversing its flow. The entropy of the universe would decrease, heat would flow from cold to hot, and effects would precede their causes. This seems to violate some of the most fundamental laws of physics, particularly the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases or remains constant, never decreases. To rewind time, you would need to reverse the fundamental arrow of time, the directionality that makes the future different from the past. This arrow is associated with entropy increase, but it also appears in other areas of physics. Quantum measurements seem to have a direction in time, with measurements affecting subsequent events, but not previous ones. The expansion of the universe creates a cosmic arrow of time, with the universe growing larger. As time moves forward, reversing all of these arrows simultaneously might require changing the fundamental laws of physics themselves. One way to think about rewinding time is to imagine that you are not actually reversing time for the entire universe, but rather moving backward through a pre-existing timeline while retaining your own forward-moving consciousness. In this model, the timeline is like a recording that you can scroll backward through, with all events already laid out in space-time. When you rewind, you are simply changing your position in this timeline, moving to an earlier point while keeping your memories of later points intact. But this model raises the question of what happens to the time between your rewind point and your starting point. If you rewind from Tuesday to Monday, does Tuesday still exist somewhere in space-time, or has it been erased? If it still exists, then you have not truly changed the past, but only created a branch point where a new timeline diverges from the old one. If Tuesday has been erased, then you have eliminated a section of space-time from existence, which raises questions about conservation of energy and information. The concept of branching timelines leads us to consider another model of time rewind, where each rewind creates a new timeline that diverges from the original. In this model, the timeline where you had the argument with your friend still exists, but you have moved to a parallel timeline where the argument never happened. The original timeline continues without you, while you now inhabit a new timeline with a different history. This branching model preserves causality and avoids many of the paradoxes of time reversal, but it raises its own troubling questions. If the original timeline still exists, then you have not actually undone anything. The argument still happened, your friend still got hurt, and the negative consequences still unfolded. You have simply abandoned that timeline and jumped to a better one. This is less like undoing a mistake and more like fleeing from consequences. Moreover, if each rewind creates a new timeline, then you leave behind a trail of abandoned realities, each one containing people who knew you until the moment you rewound and disappeared from their lives. These abandoned timelines would continue without you, and the people in them might wonder what happened to you. From their perspective, you would have simply vanished mysteriously at the moment of rewind. If you use rewind frequently, you could be creating thousands or millions of abandoned timelines, each one a complete universe populated by conscious beings living out their lives. The ethical implications of this are staggering, as you would be creating and abandoning entire worlds based on your personal preferences. Let us now consider an even more powerful form of time control, the ability to fast forward through time, skipping ahead to future moments without experiencing the intervening duration. This power would allow you to avoid boring or unpleasant periods of time, to see the outcomes of long-term processes instantly, or to travel into the future to see how events unfold. At first glance, fast-forwarding through time might seem less problematic than pausing or rewinding. You would not be changing anything or interfering with anyone else's timeline, simply skipping ahead in your own experience. If you are stuck in a tedious meeting, you could fast-forward to the end and avoid the boredom. If you are waiting for test results or the outcome of a job application, you could skip ahead to the moment when you receive the news. If you are curious about how a situation will develop, you could fast-forward to see the outcome. But fast-forwarding raises its own set of philosophical puzzles. When you skip ahead in time, what happens to your consciousness during the intervening period? Do you simply cease to exist for that duration, only to reappear at the forward point? Or does your consciousness remain present, but inactive, like a computer in sleep mode? If you cease to exist during the fast forward, then you are repeatedly destroying and recreating yourself, which raises questions about the continuity of personal identity. Are you the same person who started the fast forward, or are you a new person with the memories of the old one? The practical implications of fast forwarding are also significant. When you skip ahead, your body would age and change according to the time that passed, even though you did not experience it. If you fast forward through a week, you would arrive 7 days older, hungrier, and more tired, even though the week seemed instantaneous to you. This would limit how far you could safely fast forward without endangering your health. A fast forward of several months might leave you dangerously malnourished and dehydrated. From the perspective of other people, you would appear to exist, but be completely unresponsive during the fast forward period. They might see you sitting or standing motionless, not reacting to any stimuli, like a person in a catatonic state. If you fast forwarded through a conversation, they would see you suddenly zone out and become unresponsive, then suddenly snap back to awareness later. This would be disturbing and confusing for them, and they might worry about your mental health. The ability to fast forward could be misused to avoid responsibility or difficult emotional experiences. You could skip past moments of grief, fear, or discomfort, never developing the emotional resilience that comes from working through difficult feelings. You could avoid conversations where you need to be held accountable, fast forwarding through confrontations or difficult discussions. Over time, this might lead to emotional immaturity and an inability to handle normal life challenges. On the other hand, fast forwarding could be used to survive genuinely unbearable situations. Someone trapped in a disaster could fast forward through the ordeal, arriving at the moment of rescue without experiencing the trauma and suffering of the intervening time. Someone with a terminal illness could skip the painful final stages of their disease, experiencing only the peaceful moments. This could be a mercy, reducing suffering without changing the outcome. The most intriguing use of fast forward would be to glimpse the future. You could fast forward to see how situations develop, what choices lead to what outcomes, and what the long-term consequences of different decisions might be. But here we encounter a strange paradox. If you fast forward to see the outcome of a decision, you might then rewind or make a different choice based on what you learned. This creates a loop where the future you observed never actually occurs because observing it caused you to change your behavior. This is similar to the observer effect in quantum mechanics, where the act of measurement changes the system being measured. By observing the future, you change it, which means the future you observed was never going to happen anyway. This raises deep questions about determinism and free will. If the future exists in a definite form that you can observe by fast forwarding, then it would seem that the future is predetermined and fixed. But if your observation of the future allows you to change it, then the future must be open and undetermined. These two ideas seem contradictory, suggesting that fast forwarding to observe the future might be logically impossible, or at least that what you observe when you fast forward is not the actual future, but merely one possible future among many. Now let us consider the most radical form of time control, the ability to step outside of time entirely, to exist in a timeless state where past, present, and future are all equally accessible and all exist simultaneously. In this state, you would perceive time not as a flowing river, but as a landscape that you can survey in its entirety. All moments would be spread out before you like locations on a map, and you could move freely between them, visiting any time just as easily as you currently move between different places in space. This godlike perspective on time would fundamentally transform your understanding of reality and your place within it. From outside time, you would see the entire history of the universe laid out as a single, unified structure. The Big Bang would not be an ancient event but a location at one end of the temporal landscape. The heat death of the universe, trillions of years in the future, would be a location at the other end. Your own life would appear as a thin thread winding through this landscape, connecting different moments in a continuous path from birth to death. Seeing time from this external perspective would reveal patterns and connections that are invisible from within the flow of time. you might see how events in different time periods influence each other, how the past shapes the future, not through simple linear causality, but through complex networks of cause and effect that loop and interweave across the timeline. You might understand why things happened the way they did, seeing the larger patterns that make sense only when viewed from outside the temporal flow. The experience of existing outside time would be fundamentally different from anything we can imagine from our time-bound perspective. Without the flow of time, there would be no change, no motion, no process, no becoming. Everything would simply exist in an eternal, static state. Thoughts themselves require time to unfold, as neural processes fire in sequence to create the stream of consciousness we experience. Outside time, thought in the normal sense might be impossible. You might instead experience a kind of immediate, total knowing, where all information is present simultaneously without the sequential processing that characterizes normal consciousness. This timeless state might be similar to mystical experiences reported across different spiritual traditions, experiences of unity with the cosmos, of transcending personal identity, of existing in an eternal now where all distinctions dissolve. Mystics have described moments where time seems to stop, where they feel connected to all of existence simultaneously, where past and future collapse into an eternal present. Perhaps these experiences are glimpses of what it would be like to truly exist outside time. From outside time, you would face a peculiar challenge when trying to interact with the temporal world. Any action you take, any change you make, would require you to re-enter time at a specific moment. But which moment would you choose? You could appear at any point in history, in any location, with the ability to influence events at that moment. This would make you not just a time traveler but a temporal god, capable of shaping history according to your will. The ethical implications of this power are almost too vast to contemplate. You could prevent wars, stop genocides, cure diseases, avert disasters. You could ensure that specific people meet, that crucial discoveries are made, that history unfolds in ways that maximize human welfare. You would have the power to reshape civilization itself, guiding it toward better outcomes. But with this power comes almost unbearable responsibility. How would you decide which events to change and which to leave alone? Every change you make would have ripple effects throughout history, affecting millions or billions of lives in ways you might not be able to predict. Preventing one tragedy might inadvertently cause others. Saving one person might prevent another from being born. The interconnectedness of historical events is so complex that even small changes could lead to radically different outcomes. This is often called the butterfly effect in chaos theory, the idea that small changes to initial conditions can lead to vastly different results over time. A butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil might set off a chain of events that leads to a tornado in Texas. Similarly, a small change you make in the past might transform the entire future in unexpected ways. You might save a life only to discover that the person you saved goes on to cause great harm. You might prevent a disaster only to find that the disaster would have led to important changes that made the future better. The philosopher's question of whether the ends justify the means would take on new significance when you have the power to see both ends and means across all of time. You could know the full consequences of your actions, but that knowledge might not make your choices any easier. You might discover that many terrible events in history were necessary for later good outcomes, or that many good events led to later disasters. The moral complexity would be overwhelming. From outside time, you might also gain insight into the question of whether time is real or illusory. Philosophers have long debated whether time truly flows, or whether the flow of time is merely a subjective experience created by consciousness. If you can step outside time and see all moments laid out equally, this would suggest that the flow of time is indeed an illusion. The past does not cease to exist when it becomes past, and the future does not come into existence when it arrives. Instead, all moments exist equally in the space-time continuum, and the sense of flow we experience is a product of our limited, time-bound perspective. This view of time, called eternalism or the block universe theory, has profound implications for questions of free will and determinism. If all moments of time exist equally, then the future already exists in just as definite a form as the past. Your future actions are already laid out in the space-time block, just as your past actions are. This would seem to imply that free will is an illusion, that your choices are predetermined by the structure of space-time itself. But having access to the block universe from outside might allow you to change it, to literally rewrite the structure of space-time. This would suggest a strange form of meta-time, a higher-level temporal dimension in which the block universe itself can change and evolve. You would exist not within time but in this meta-time, able to modify the four-dimensional space-time block as if it were a sculpture that you can reshape. The physics of existing outside time would be unlike anything we can currently understand. Our entire physical framework assumes the existence of time. The laws of physics are formulated as differential equations that describe how things change over time. Without time, these laws would be meaningless. You would need entirely new physics to describe your timeless existence, perhaps based on pure geometry and topology rather than dynamics and evolution. Quantum mechanics might provide hints about what timeless existence could be like. In quantum field theory, particles are not fundamental objects but rather excitations of underlying fields that permeate all of space-time. These fields exist across all of time, not flowing through it, but simply being distributed across the space-time landscape. Perhaps existing outside time would be like becoming a quantum field yourself, spread across all moments rather than confined to a single present. The experience of re-entering time from a timeless state would be like choosing to limit yourself, to confine yourself to a single moment and single perspective after having experienced the totality. It would be a voluntary reduction in your awareness and capabilities, stepping down from godhood into mortality. Why would you choose to do this? Perhaps because genuine experience requires the flow of time, because meaning and value emerge from change and process, because love and connection require shared temporal experience with others. Let us now consider how having control over time would affect your relationships with other people. In many ways, time control would create an unbridgeable gap between you and everyone else. You would have experiences that no one else could share or understand. You would remember events that never happened for others, or that happened differently in timelines you have since abandoned. You would have lived subjectively longer than your biological age suggests, accumulating wisdom and experience that would make you seem older than you are. Your friends and family would notice that you sometimes seem to know things you should not know, that you occasionally refer to events that never occurred, that you have skills and knowledge that you could not have acquired in the time available. They might think you are becoming confused or mentally ill, unable to distinguish reality from imagination. You would need to constantly monitor what you say and do, remembering which timeline you are in and what other people know and do not know. This would be emotionally exhausting and isolating. The temptation to use time control in relationships would be strong. You could rewind arguments until you find the perfect words to resolve conflicts. You could fast forward through difficult periods in relationships, skipping the awkward early stages or the painful endings. You could pause time to think about what to say next in important conversations, never appearing flustered or at a loss for words. But using time control this way would fundamentally undermine the authenticity of your relationships. Real relationships involve vulnerability, uncertainty, and the risk of saying the wrong thing or making mistakes. They require both people to navigate challenges together, learning and growing through shared experiences. If you are secretly controlling time to engineer perfect outcomes, you rob both yourself and the other person of genuine connection. Your partner might feel like they are in a perfect relationship, but they would not know that this perfection is artificially maintained by your manipulation of time. Every conflict that was resolved through rewinding, every awkward moment that was edited out, would represent a loss of authentic shared experience. The relationship would be perfect but false, a simulation of intimacy rather than the real thing. Moreover, you would never truly know how the other person would respond to your unedited self. The person they love would be a carefully curated version of you, stripped of all the mistakes and awkwardness that define real human interaction. They would not love the real you, but rather an idealized version that you have created through temporal editing. Some people might argue that this is not fundamentally different from how we already present ourselves in relationships. We all try to put our best foot forward, to think before we speak, to avoid saying things we might regret. Time control would simply be a more effective version of this natural self-editing. But there is a crucial difference. Normal self-editing happens within the constraints of time. We cannot take back words once spoken or undo actions once taken. This limitation forces us to accept our imperfections and live with our mistakes. It creates a shared reality where both people experience the same events and must work through conflicts together. Time control would eliminate this shared reality, creating a fundamental asymmetry in the relationship. The question of whether to reveal your time control powers to others would be agonizing. Keeping it secret would require constant vigilance and dishonesty, creating a barrier between you and everyone else. But revealing it might be even worse. How would people react to knowing that you can manipulate their reality without their knowledge? They might feel violated, manipulated, or fearful. They might question every interaction you have had, wondering how many times you rewound and edited your conversations. Even if you promised never to use your powers on them, they might not believe you. The very existence of time control would poison trust, making genuine connection impossible. Friends might become paranoid, wondering if their memories are real or if you have rewritten them. Romantic partners might question whether your love is genuine or whether you engineered their feelings through timeline manipulation. The social fabric would unravel as people realized that their sense of shared reality could be an illusion maintained by someone with the power to rewrite history. On the other hand, you might find connection with others who also possess time control abilities, if such people exist. With them, you could share your experiences openly, discussing the challenges and ethical dilemmas of temporal manipulation without fear of being misunderstood. You could compare notes on different timelines, discussing what happened in realities that no longer exist. This shared understanding might create bonds deeper than any normal relationship based on truly unique common ground. But even these relationships would be complicated. If two people with time control powers interact, whose version of events takes precedence? If you both rewind the same conversation, which rewind wins? Do your powers cancel each other out, or do you create branching timelines that diverge from each other? The metaphysics of multiple time controllers interacting would be enormously complex and potentially paradoxical. Let us explore the psychological effects of time control in more depth. Having unlimited power over time would fundamentally change your personality, your values, and your sense of self in ways that might not be immediately obvious. The removal of consequences would be one of the most profound changes. In normal life, every action has consequences that we must live with. This creates a natural system of feedback that shapes our behavior. We learn from mistakes because we must live with their results. We develop self-control because we know we cannot take back our actions. But with time control, consequences become optional. Any negative outcome can be rewound and erased. This might lead to what psychologists call moral hazard, a situation where the absence of consequences leads to increasingly reckless behavior. You might become impulsive, saying or doing whatever comes to mind without considering the impact, knowing you can always rewind if things go wrong. Over time, this could erode your capacity for empathy and consideration. Why bother thinking about how others will react when you can just try different approaches until you find one that works? The development of virtue and character typically requires struggling with difficult situations, making mistakes, and learning from them. Time control would short-circuit this process, allowing you to achieve good outcomes without developing the wisdom and character that normally make good outcomes possible. You might become skilled at manipulating situations without becoming wise about human nature. You might learn to say the right words without understanding why they are right. You would be like an actor who delivers a perfect performance by trying thousands of takes, rather than a skilled performer who gets it right the first time through genuine understanding and talent. The meaning of achievement would also change with time control. Normally, accomplishments feel meaningful, partly because they required effort, risk, and the possibility of failure. A mountain climber feels pride in reaching the summit because the climb was difficult and dangerous. An artist feels satisfaction in completing a painting because it required skill and persistence. But if you can pause time to practice indefinitely, or rewind time to try unlimited attempts, do your achievements still mean anything? If you become a virtuoso pianist by pausing time and practicing for years while no time passes, are you truly skilled, or have you just ground out competence through brute force? If you win a chess championship by rewinding after every move until you find the perfect sequence, have you really defeated your opponents, or have you simply cheated in a way that is undetectable? The philosophical question of whether the process or the outcome matters more would become urgent and personal. You might conclude that outcomes are all that matter, that the end justifies the means, even if the means involve temporal manipulation. Or you might feel that achievements gained through time control are hollow and meaningless, that true accomplishment requires genuine struggle and the possibility of failure. This could lead to a profound crisis of meaning, where nothing feels genuinely earned or deserved. Your sense of personal identity would also be challenged by time control. Normally, we understand ourselves through narrative, through the story of our lives unfolding in a linear sequence from past to future. We remember our past, anticipate our future, and understand our present as a chapter in an ongoing story. But with time control, your life would not have a simple linear narrative. You would remember multiple versions of events, alternate timelines that were abandoned, futures that were observed and then prevented. Your past would be a tangled web of possible histories rather than a single coherent story. Who are you if your history is constantly being rewritten? The psychological concept of narrative identity suggests that we construct our sense of self through the stories we tell about our lives. These stories give us continuity and coherence, connecting our past self to our present self and our anticipated future self. Time control would fragment this narrative, creating a discontinuous self with multiple pasts and multiple possible futures. Some philosophers argue that personal identity depends on memory continuity. You are the same person you were yesterday because you remember being that person and having their experiences. But what if you remember being multiple different people in different timelines? What if your memories contradict each other, with some memories saying you did one thing and other memories saying you did something completely different? Your sense of a coherent self might begin to break down, replaced by a more fluid identity that shifts between different versions of yourself. This could be liberating or terrifying. On one hand, you would be free from the constraints of a fixed identity, able to explore different ways of being without being locked into any particular self-concept. On the other hand, you might feel unmoored, lacking the stable sense of self that gives life coherence and direction. The experience of existing across multiple timelines might lead to a kind of temporal dissociation, where you feel disconnected from any particular moment or version of reality. The present would lose its urgency, because you know you can always rewind it. The past would lose its fixity, because you know it can be changed. The future would lose its mystery, because you can observe it directly. Without the constraints that normally give life structure and meaning, you might feel like you are drifting through existence without anchor or purpose. Alternatively, time control might lead to a more expansive sense of self that embraces multiplicity and change. You might come to see yourself not as a single thread moving through time, but as a multi-dimensional being existing across many timelines simultaneously. This could lead to a more mature understanding of identity as fluid and contextual rather than fixed and essential. You might become comfortable with contradiction and ambiguity, recognizing that you can be different things in different contexts without losing your core sense of self. The question of free will would become intensely personal and immediate with time control. If you can observe the future, does that mean the future is predetermined? If you can change the past, does that mean the past was not fixed? These abstract philosophical questions would become concrete aspects of your daily experience. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that the future exists as a superposition of possibilities that collapse into definite outcomes only when observed. If this is true, then using time control to observe the future might actually create the future you observe, collapsing the quantum possibilities into a specific timeline. In this view, you would not be observing a predetermined future, but rather causing a particular future to come into existence through the act of observation. This would preserve free will in a strange way. The future would be open and undetermined until you look at it at which point your observation would force it into a specific form, but then you could rewind and make different choices, causing a different future to collapse into existence. You would be exercising free will, not just in making choices, but in collapsing quantum possibilities into specific realities. However, this raises the question of what determines which quantum possibilities collapse when you observe the future. If the collapse is truly random, then you are not really controlling anything. If it is determined by some deeper law, then we are back to determinism. And if your consciousness somehow chooses which possibility collapses, then we are invoking a mysterious power of mind over matter that goes beyond anything in conventional physics. The lived experience of having time control might lead you to pragmatic answers to these philosophical questions, regardless of their ultimate truth. You might simply accept that you can change events through rewinding, that you can observe possible futures through fast-forwarding, and that you can pause time to create space for reflection. Whether this represents true free will or just a more complex form of determinism might become less important than the practical reality of how to use these powers wisely and ethically. Let us consider some specific scenarios that would test the limits of time control and raise profound ethical questions. Imagine you witness a terrible accident, a building collapse that kills dozens of people. You have the power to rewind time and prevent this disaster. Of course you would do so, but when you investigate, you discover that the building collapsed because of corrupt construction practices and lax safety regulations. If you simply prevent this particular collapse, the underlying problems remain and will cause other disasters in the future. Do you just prevent this one accident, or do you go back further in time to address the root causes? If you go back far enough to prevent the corruption and regulatory failures, you might change the lives of thousands of people who were not even in the building. Some of these changes might be for the worse. People who were fired due to your intervention might have been supporting families. Companies that went bankrupt might have been providing employment to communities. The ripple effects extend outward in ways you cannot fully predict or control. How many unintended consequences are acceptable in pursuit of preventing the original disaster? Now imagine a different scenario. Someone you love is dying from a terminal illness. You could rewind time to before they became sick and use your knowledge to ensure they get early treatment. But when you do this, you discover that in the new timeline, someone else dies instead. Perhaps because medical resources that would have gone to them were used to treat your loved one. Do you keep the new timeline where your loved one lives? Or do you rewind again to restore the original timeline? What if the person who dies in the new timeline is a stranger? What if they are also someone's loved one? Do you have the right to decide who lives and who dies based on your personal relationships? Consider a scenario involving knowledge and discovery. You fast forward into the future and observe a major scientific breakthrough, a cure for cancer, or a solution to climate change. You return to your own time with knowledge of this future discovery. Do you share this knowledge, claiming credit for work that someone else will do in the future? Do you give the credit to the future discoverer, even though they have not done the work yet in the current timeline? Do you keep the knowledge secret to avoid disrupting the timeline? If you share the knowledge, you accelerate human progress and potentially save millions of lives. But you also steal credit from the researcher who would have made the discovery, changing their life and career. The person who was going to win a Nobel Prize for this work might instead live an unremarkable life in the timeline where you revealed their discovery early. Do the millions of lives saved justify this theft of credit and alteration of someone's destiny? These scenarios reveal a common theme in the ethics of time control: the fundamental tension between consequentialism and deontology, between judging actions by their outcomes versus judging them by whether they follow ethical principles. Time control gives you access to consequences in a way that normal humans do not have. You can see the results of different choices before committing to them. This would seem to favor a consequentialist approach where you simply choose the actions that lead to the best outcomes. But the ability to see and change outcomes raises troubling questions about autonomy, consent, and the rights of others. Even if you are creating better outcomes, you are doing so by manipulating reality in ways that affect millions of people without their knowledge or consent. This seems to violate deontological principles about respecting persons as ends in themselves rather than means to your desired outcomes. You might develop a hybrid ethical framework that combines consequentialist and deontological considerations. You could use your powers to improve outcomes, but only within certain ethical constraints. For example, you might follow a principle of minimal intervention, only using time control when absolutely necessary to prevent severe harm. Or you might follow a principle of transparency, using your powers only in ways that you would be willing to reveal to those affected if they could understand. The development of a personal ethics of time control would be one of your greatest challenges and responsibilities. Without such an ethical framework, you might become either paralyzed by indecision, afraid to use your powers because of the unintended consequences, or corrupted by power, using your abilities selfishly without regard for others. Finding the middle path between these extremes would require wisdom that might be beyond human capacity. The long-term psychological effects of time control would extend beyond ethical questions to affect your basic, emotional, and cognitive functioning. Consider how time control would affect your experience of emotions. Emotions typically have a temporal structure. We anticipate future events with hope or anxiety, we experience present moments with joy or sadness, and we remember past events with nostalgia or regret. But time control would disrupt this normal temporal structure of emotion. If you can rewind past events, does regret still make sense? Regret is normally a painful emotion that arises from wishing we had acted differently in the past. But if you can change the past, regret becomes action rather than just feeling. Every time you feel regret, you would be tempted to rewind and do things differently. This might sound liberating, but it could actually prevent you from developing the psychological coping mechanisms that help people come to terms with mistakes and move forward. Similarly, anticipation and anxiety about the future would be transformed if you can fast forward to observe outcomes. Why be anxious about an upcoming event when you can simply skip ahead and see how it turns out? But this would eliminate the emotional preparation that anticipation provides, the mental rehearsal and planning that help us cope with challenges. You might arrive at difficult moments emotionally unprepared because you skipped the natural anticipation phase. The normal human experience of savoring positive experiences and dreading negative ones would be disrupted. You could skip all negative experiences, but doing so might diminish your capacity to appreciate positive ones. Psychologists have found that happiness is not just about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, but about having a full emotional range and finding meaning through both positive and negative experiences. A life with only pleasant moments, achieved by fast-forwarding through anything unpleasant, might be emotionally shallow and unsatisfying. The ability to pause time might seem like it would reduce stress by giving you unlimited time to handle any challenge, but it might actually increase anxiety. Knowing that you could pause time to deal with something might make you more anxious about whether you are using your time optimally. Every decision would carry the weight of knowing that you could have paused time to consider it more carefully, research it more thoroughly, or practice your response more extensively. The concept of flow, the psychological state of being completely immersed in an activity, might become impossible with time control. Flow typically occurs when we are challenged at just the right level, when a task is difficult enough to require our full attention but not so difficult as to be overwhelming. But if you can pause time whenever something becomes challenging, you would never need to push through difficulty and never achieve the satisfying state of flow that comes from meeting challenges head-on. Your relationship with memory would also be fundamentally altered. Memory normally serves to connect our past self to our present self, creating continuity of identity and allowing us to learn from experience. But with time control, you would have memories that do not correspond to the current timeline. You might remember events that never happened for anyone else, conversations that were rewound and replaced, futures that were observed but then prevented. These paradoxical memories could be confusing and distressing. You might struggle to distinguish between memories of the current timeline and memories of abandoned timelines. Over time, your mind might become cluttered with ghost memories, recollections of events that exist only in your consciousness. The cognitive load of managing multiple sets of memories could be overwhelming, potentially leading to confusion, dissociation, or even psychosis. Some psychological research suggests that our memories are not perfect recordings of events, but are reconstructed each time we recall them, influenced by our current knowledge and beliefs. If this is true, then your memories of abandoned timelines might gradually change and degrade over time, becoming less reliable. You might remember that you rewound a particular event, but forget what actually happened in the abandoned timeline, leaving you with a vague sense that something used to be different but uncertainty about what it was. Sleep and dreams would take on new significance with time control. Sleep might become a dangerous time when you lose conscious control over your powers. You might accidentally trigger time control in your sleep, pausing time during a nightmare or rewinding to the beginning of a good dream. Or you might find that you cannot control time while sleeping, making sleep the only time when you are vulnerable to the normal flow of temporal events. Dreams might also blend with your experiences of different timelines, making it even harder to distinguish between real memories and imagined ones. The question of whether to have children would become enormously complicated if you possess time control. Children inherit not just their parents' genetics, but also their understanding of the world, their values, and their relationship with reality. How would you raise a child when your experience of reality is so different from everyone else's? Would you tell them about your powers? If you do not tell them, you would have to hide a fundamental aspect of yourself, creating a barrier in your most important relationship. If you do tell them, you burden them with a secret they must keep, and knowledge that might make it impossible for them to relate to their peers. Would they develop normally, or would knowing about time control distort their psychological development? Moreover, if you use time control around your children, you would be manipulating their reality without their knowledge. You might rewind arguments or difficult moments, meaning their memories of their childhood would be different from what actually happened in the current timeline. You would be making decisions about what experiences they should have, shaping their development through temporal editing in ways they could never know about or consent to. The question of whether you would pass your time control abilities to your children would be crucial. If time control is an inherent ability you were born with, your children might inherit it. How would you teach them to use such dangerous powers responsibly? How could you give them enough guidance without controlling their lives? The normal difficulties of parenting, trying to guide children while allowing them to make their own mistakes and develop independently, would be magnified enormously when the mistakes could be rewound and the development could be edited. If your children do not inherit time control, they might feel inferior or resentful, knowing that you have abilities they lack. They might feel that your relationship with them is not genuine, suspecting that you use time control to manipulate interactions with them, or they might simply feel that they can never truly understand you, that there is a fundamental gap between your experience and theirs that prevents real connection. Let us now consider how society as a whole would be affected if time control abilities became widespread. Imagine that through some technological advancement or genetic mutation, many people gain the ability to control time. How would civilization adapt to this new reality? The most immediate impact would be on social trust and shared reality. Currently, we assume that we all experience the same timeline, that the past is fixed and the future unknown. This shared assumption underlies our social institutions, legal systems, and personal relationships. But if people can rewind time, the assumption of shared reality collapses. You could no longer trust that events actually happened the way you remember them. Someone with time control could have rewound and changed things, leaving you with false memories of a timeline that no longer exists. This would create a form of collective gaslighting, where your memories could be invalidated by someone else's decision to rewind time. Legal and political systems would struggle to function in a world with multiple time controllers. How do you determine guilt or innocence when the accused might have rewound time to eliminate evidence? How do you enforce contracts when parties might rewind to the moment before signing? How do you conduct elections when candidates might rewind and change their campaigns based on knowing the results? The entire framework of law depends on the assumption that events have a definite history that can be investigated and established. Time control would undermine this assumption, making it nearly impossible to establish facts or assign responsibility. Different time controllers might create conflicting timelines, each rewinding events to favor their preferred outcomes. The result could be a temporal war, with different factions repeatedly rewinding and rewriting history in an attempt to achieve their goals. History would become unstable, constantly shifting as different groups manipulate past events. This could lead to a complete breakdown of social order, with no shared sense of reality to serve as a foundation for cooperation. Alternatively, society might develop new institutions and norms to govern the use of time control. There might be laws restricting when and how time control can be used, with severe penalties for violations. There might be a licensing system where only authorized individuals can use time control for approved purposes. There might be temporal police who monitor timeline changes and intervene to prevent temporal crimes or resolve temporal disputes. The economic implications of widespread time control would be profound. Markets depend on information asymmetry and timing. If traders could fast forward to see market movements or rewind to avoid losses, traditional markets would collapse. Everyone would try to use time control to gain an advantage, leading to a paradoxical situation where no one has an advantage because everyone is manipulating time. New economic systems might emerge that are designed to function in a world with time control. Perhaps markets would be replaced by cooperative planning, where everyone can observe all possible timelines and negotiate to find outcomes that work for everyone. Or perhaps the economy would fragment into isolated temporal zones, each with its own timeline that does not interact with the others. Work and productivity would change dramatically if people could pause time to accomplish tasks. A job that normally takes 8 hours could be completed in what appears to be an instant by pausing time and working in the frozen moment. This would make human labor incredibly productive, but might also devalue work. If anyone can accomplish any task given enough paused time, then skill and talent become less important than willingness to spend subjective time. In the frozen world, education would be transformed if students could pause time to study or rewind to retake tests. Everyone could achieve perfect grades by simply taking enough attempts. This would eliminate the current function of education as a sorting mechanism that identifies and credentials talent. New forms of assessment might be needed that test not just knowledge, but also creativity, character, or abilities that cannot be enhanced through simple time manipulation. Science and technology would advance at an unprecedented rate if researchers could pause time to conduct experiments, rewind failed attempts, or fast forward to see long-term results. Medical research could test drugs and treatments by fast-forwarding to observe outcomes, then rewinding if the results are negative. Engineering could develop new technologies through rapid iteration, rewinding each failure and trying new approaches. But this accelerated advancement would come with risks. Technologies could be developed and deployed without adequate consideration of long-term consequences, because researchers could always rewind if something goes wrong. Except that at a civilizational level, it might be impossible to rewind. If everyone is independently controlling time, whose rewind takes precedence? Art and culture would evolve in interesting directions in a world with time control. Artists could pause time to work on their creations for subjective years, producing incredibly detailed and sophisticated works. Musicians could fast forward through years of practice to achieve mastery. Writers could rewind and revise their works unlimited times, optimizing every word. But this might lead to a kind of artistic perfectionism that eliminates the spontaneity and imperfection that often make art interesting. Art might become technically perfect but emotionally sterile, lacking the human touch that comes from working within constraints. Alternatively, new forms of temporal art might emerge that specifically incorporate time control. Sculptures that exist across multiple timelines, paintings that change depending on which timeline you observe them from, music that sounds different if you rewind to different points. The experience of art could become interactive and multidimensional, with audiences able to explore different temporal versions of the same work. Entertainment and sports would need to adapt to time control. If athletes can rewind to perfect their performances or fast forward to see the outcome of plays, traditional competition becomes meaningless. Sports might evolve to test not just physical abilities but also skill at time control, creating new forms of temporal athletics where competitors try to outmaneuver each other across multiple timelines. Games might develop where the objective is to create the most favorable timeline or to navigate through a maze of possible futures. The concept of privacy would take on new dimensions in a world with time control. If people can pause time to explore private spaces or rewind to observe private moments, traditional privacy protections become ineffective. Society might develop new forms of temporal encryption or timeline isolation to protect private information, or privacy might become a luxury available only to those who can afford temporal shielding technology. Religion and spirituality would grapple with the implications of time control. Many religious traditions emphasize acceptance, living in the present moment, and trusting in divine providence. Time control seems to contradict these values by giving humans the power to control and manipulate reality. Religious leaders might condemn time control as playing God, or they might develop new theological frameworks that incorporate time control as part of the divine plan. Some spiritual traditions might embrace time control as a path to enlightenment, seeing the ability to step outside the normal flow of time as a way to achieve a higher perspective on reality. Meditation practices might incorporate time control, using paused or slowed time to deepen contemplative states. The mystical experience of timelessness that many traditions seek might become literally achievable through time control. The environmental implications of widespread time control are difficult to predict. On one hand, people could use time control to observe the long-term environmental impacts of different actions and choose more sustainable paths. Climate change could be addressed by fast-forwarding to see outcomes and then rewinding to implement better policies. On the other hand, the ability to rewind might reduce the urgency of environmental protection. Why worry about irreversible damage when you can always rewind and take a different path? This could lead to reckless behavior and environmental destruction, with people assuming they can always undo the damage later. There is also the question of whether environmental damage can actually be undone by rewinding time. If rewinding creates a new timeline rather than actually reversing events, then environmental damage in the original timeline remains, and you have simply jumped to a cleaner timeline. This would not solve environmental problems but merely allow you to escape from them. Healthcare would be revolutionized by time control. Doctors could pause time during surgery to consult resources and plan their approach. Patients could fast-forward through painful treatments or recovery periods. Diseases could be studied by fast-forwarding to see their progression and then rewinding to test different treatments. But time control might also create new health challenges. If people can skip through unpleasant aspects of medical treatment, they might neglect their health, knowing they can always fast-forward past the consequences. If people can rewind to before they got sick, they might engage in risky behaviors without concern for health impacts. Mental health might suffer as people use time control to avoid difficult emotions rather than processing them. The question of mortality takes on new dimensions with time control. Could you rewind to before someone died and prevent their death? This would make death seem optional and reversible, fundamentally changing how society thinks about mortality. But there would be limits. You cannot rewind to before your own birth, so your own death might still be final. And if multiple people have time control, they might create conflicting timelines around death, with some people trying to prevent a death while others allow it to occur. The meaning of life might change if death becomes optional through time control. Much of what gives life meaning is its finitude, the fact that our time is limited and precious. If we can extend life indefinitely by rewinding whenever death approaches, life might lose its urgency and meaning. We might become careless with our time, knowing we can always get more through temporal manipulation. Alternatively, the ability to control time might make life more meaningful by allowing us to fully explore its possibilities. We could pursue every interest, learn every skill, and explore every path without being limited by the brevity of human lifespan. Life would become not a single thread from birth to death, but an infinitely branching tree of possibilities that we can explore freely. Let us consider the question of consciousness and identity in a world with time control from a different angle. Some philosophers and scientists have proposed that consciousness itself might be fundamentally related to time. The philosopher Edmund Husserl argued that consciousness is essentially temporal, structured around the retention of the immediate past, the experience of the present, and the pretension or anticipation of the immediate future. If consciousness is essentially temporal in this way, then controlling time might fundamentally alter consciousness itself. When you pause time, what happens to your consciousness? If consciousness requires the flow of time to function, then pausing time might pause consciousness as well. But then you would not be able to experience or act during the pause, which defeats the purpose. This suggests that pausing time might actually mean creating a massive time dilation where your consciousness continues at a normal rate while everything else slows to a near stop. But this raises questions about the relationship between consciousness and physical brain processes. Consciousness seems to arise from neural activity in the brain, and neural activity is a physical process that occurs in time. If time is truly paused, neural activity should stop and consciousness should cease. For you to remain conscious during a time pause, your brain must be operating outside the stopped time, continuing to process information at a normal rate while the rest of the universe is frozen. This creates a strange dualism where your consciousness exists in a different temporal frame than your body. Your brain is simultaneously part of the frozen physical world and part of the moving conscious world. This might require a form of quantum superposition where your neurons exist in multiple temporal states at once, or it might suggest that consciousness is not entirely physical and can detach from normal spacetime under certain conditions. The hard problem of consciousness, explaining how subjective experience arises from physical processes, becomes even harder when we consider time control. If consciousness can exist independently of normal time, this suggests it has properties that transcend physical reality as we normally understand it. This might support theories that consciousness is fundamental to the universe rather than emergent from physical processes, or it might require entirely new physics that describes how consciousness relates to spacetime. The experience of controlling time might provide insights into the nature of consciousness that are a. impossible to gain through normal experience. By manipulating your temporal relationship to the world, you might discover which aspects of consciousness depend on time and which do not. You might find that certain mental processes can operate outside normal time while others cannot, revealing the structure of consciousness in new ways. For example, you might discover that sensory perception requires time to function, as your brain needs time to process incoming signals and construct coherent perceptual experiences. But abstract thought might be able to operate in paused time, allowing you to reason and reflect without the passage of time. This would suggest that consciousness has multiple layers or components with different temporal requirements. Memory encoding and retrieval might also work differently in controlled time. In normal experience, memories are formed through physical changes in the brain that take time to occur. But if you can pause time and still form memories, this suggests that memory might have a non-physical component or might be encoded in a way that transcends normal spacetime. Your memories of events in paused time would have to be stored somehow, but where and how could this storage occur if time is not passing? The sense of self and personal identity becomes even more puzzling when we consider time control. The philosopher Derek Parfit argued that personal identity is not a deep metaphysical fact, but rather a matter of psychological continuity. You are the same person as your past self if you have memories and psychological connections to that past self. But time control creates multiple versions of yourself across different timelines, each with somewhat different memories and experiences. Which one is the real you? If you rewind time and make different choices, creating a new timeline, are you the same person in both timelines? The version of you in the abandoned timeline continues to exist in some sense, with their own memories and experiences. Are they still you, or are they a different person? The splitting of your identity across multiple timelines might lead to a more fluid conception of selfhood, where you are not a single unified entity, but rather a collection of related selves existing across different temporal branches. Some Eastern philosophical traditions already conceive of the self as fluid and constructed rather than fixed and essential. Time control might make this perspective necessary rather than optional. You might come to identify not with any particular timeline version of yourself, but with the entire multiversal structure of all your timeline selves, seeing yourself as a four-dimensional or even five-dimensional being that exists across multiple temporal dimensions. Meditation and contemplative practices might take on new significance as tools for managing the psychological challenges of time control. If normal consciousness becomes fragmented across multiple timelines, meditation might offer a way to achieve a unified awareness that transcends particular timelines. Mindfulness practices that emphasize present moment awareness might help you stay grounded in the current timeline, rather than getting lost in memories of abandoned timelines or anticipations of possible futures. The Buddhist concept of non-attachment might be especially relevant for someone with time control. Attachment to particular outcomes becomes problematic when you can rewind and change outcomes at will. You might develop an unhealthy obsession with optimizing every situation, constantly rewinding in pursuit of perfect outcomes that may not actually exist. Learning to accept imperfection and let go of the need to control every detail might be essential for maintaining psychological health with time control powers. The experience of flow states and peak experiences might be fundamentally altered by time control. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi describes flow as a state of complete immersion in an activity where time seems to disappear and action flows effortlessly. But with the ability to literally control time, this natural flow state might be disrupted. You might become too aware of time as something you can manipulate rather than something you can lose yourself in. On the other hand, you might be able to induce flow states artificially by adjusting your perception of time. You could slow down subjective time during an activity to create the expanded awareness that characterizes flow, or you could fast forward through the awkward beginning stages of learning to reach the flow state more quickly. This might allow you to optimize your experiences in new ways, but it might also make it harder to achieve authentic flow that arises naturally from engagement with challenging activities. The concept of living in the present moment would need to be redefined with time control. Normally, the present is the narrow slice of time we currently inhabit, distinguished from the past which we cannot change and the future which we cannot know. But with time control, these distinctions collapse. You can change the past through rewinding, you can know the future through fast forwarding, and the present becomes just one temporal location among many that you can freely navigate. Living in the present might come to mean something like maintaining focus on your current timeline rather than getting distracted by all the other possible timelines you could create. It might mean choosing to experience events fully rather than constantly rewinding to edit them or fast forwarding to skip them. The value of presence would shift from a temporal concept to more of an attitude or stance toward experience, a choice to engage fully with whatever timeline you are in rather than always seeking to be somewhere or somewhen else. The relationship between time control and free will deserves deeper exploration. Philosophers have long debated whether free will is compatible with determinism, the view that all events are determined by prior causes. Time control seems to provide clear evidence of free will. If you can rewind time and make different choices, then your choices are not determined by prior causes, but are genuinely free. But this conclusion might be too quick. The ability to rewind and choose differently does not necessarily mean your choices are free. Each time you rewind, you make a choice based on your knowledge, preferences, and character at that moment. But these mental states are themselves caused by prior events and circumstances. In the rewound timeline, you have additional knowledge from the abandoned timeline, but this just means you are making a determined choice based on a different set of prior causes. True free will might require that your choices are not determined by anything, that they arise spontaneously from your consciousness without any causal antecedents. Time control does not obviously provide this kind of uncaused free will. Even if you can try multiple options by rewinding repeatedly, each choice might still be determined by your mental state at the time, which is itself determined by prior causes. However, time control might provide a different kind of freedom that is valuable even if it does not amount to metaphysical free will. You would have freedom in the sense of options and control, the ability to explore different possibilities and select the one you prefer. This might be a more practical and meaningful kind of freedom than the mysterious metaphysical free will that philosophers debate. The question of whether free will requires the ability to do otherwise takes on new significance with time control. Some compatibilist philosophers argue that free will does not require that you could have done otherwise in the exact same circumstances. Freedom is about acting according to your desires and values, not about having alternative possibilities. but time control gives you the ability to literally do otherwise, to try different actions and see what happens. Does this make your choices more free, or does it reveal that freedom is not really about alternative possibilities at all? You might discover through experience that even with unlimited ability to rewind and try different choices, you keep making the same decisions because they flow from who you are. This would suggest that free will is more about authenticity and self-expression than about having alternatives. You are free when your actions express your true values and character, even if you would make the same choice every time, given the same circumstances. Or you might find that you make different choices each time you rewind, suggesting that there is an irreducible element of randomness or spontaneity in human choice that cannot be eliminated even when you control time. This randomness might be quantum in nature, arising from quantum indeterminacy in neural processes, or it might be a fundamental feature of consciousness itself. Let us now consider some of the deeper metaphysical questions raised by time control. Is time real or illusory? Is it a fundamental feature of reality or an emergent phenomenon that arises from deeper processes? Time control might help answer these questions by revealing how time actually behaves when manipulated. If time can be paused, rewound, and fast-forwarded, this suggests that time is more like a dimension of space than a fundamental flow. Just as you can move freely through space in any direction, time control would allow you to move freely through time. This supports the block universe view, where all moments of time exist equally, and the flow of time is an illusion created by consciousness moving through this timeless landscape. But the ability to rewind time and create new timelines suggests that time might be more dynamic than the static block universe model implies. Perhaps time is more like a branching tree than a fixed block, with new timeline branches constantly being created by quantum events or conscious choices. Time control would allow you to navigate through this branching structure, moving between different branches and creating new ones. Another possibility is that time does not exist at the fundamental level of reality, but emerges from quantum entanglement and information flow. Some physicists have proposed that time is a macroscopic phenomenon that arises from the thermodynamic behavior of large collections of quantum particles. At the quantum level, there might be no time, just timeless quantum states and correlations. If this is true, then time control might work by manipulating the quantum correlations from which time emerges, reorganizing them to create different emergent temporal structures. The arrow of time, the fact that time seems to flow in one direction from past to future, is closely related to entropy, the tendency of systems to become more disordered over time. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy always increases or remains constant, never decreases. This gives time its directionality. You can tell which direction is the future by looking for the direction of entropy increase. But rewinding time would require decreasing entropy, running the universe backward to more ordered states. This seems to violate the second law of thermodynamics, one of the most fundamental laws of physics. How could time control be possible if it violates such a basic principle? One possibility is that when you rewind time, you are not actually decreasing the entropy of the entire universe, but only creating a local entropy decrease while entropy increases somewhere else to compensate. The total entropy of the universe would still increase, but you could move entropy around to create regions where time appears to run backward. This would be similar to how refrigerators create local decreases in temperature while generating more waste heat elsewhere, maintaining the overall increase in entropy. Another possibility is that rewinding time does not actually reverse entropy, but rather moves you to a parallel universe where entropy happens to be lower. The multiverse of all possible timelines might contain versions of each moment with different entropy levels. Rewinding would be more like switching between these parallel universes than actually reversing time in a single universe. The nature of causality would be revealed in new ways through time control. In normal experience, causes precede their effects in time. You flip a switch, and then the light turns on. The switching causes the light to turn on, and this causal relationship is reflected in the temporal order. But with time control, you could observe effects before their causes by fast-forwarding, or you could prevent causes from leading to their usual effects by rewinding. This might reveal that causality is more complex than simple temporal precedence. Some philosophers and physicists have argued that causality is not fundamentally about temporal order but about counterfactual dependence. An event A causes an event B if B would not have occurred without A. Time control would let you test these counterfactuals directly by rewinding and eliminating A to see if B still occurs. This could provide unprecedented insight into causal structures. You might discover that causality has a strange loop structure where effects can influence their own causes through time loops. If you fast forward to observe an effect, then rewind and use that information to cause the effect you observed, you create a closed causal loop where the effect provides the information needed to cause itself. This might seem paradoxical, but some interpretations of quantum mechanics and general relativity allow for such closed time-like curves. The question of whether the past is fixed or changeable would be answered definitively by time control. In normal experience, the past seems fixed and immutable. What happened, happened, and cannot be changed. But if you can, rewind time and change events, this shows that the past is not truly fixed, but can be rewritten. Or does it? Perhaps when you rewind and make different choices, you are not actually changing the original past, but creating a new timeline where events happen differently. The original past would still exist in the abandoned timeline, unchanged and immutable. In this view, the past is fixed within each timeline, but variable across different timelines. The ontological status of abandoned timelines would be a deep metaphysical question. When you rewind and create a new timeline, does the old timeline cease to exist, or does it continue existing in some parallel realm? If abandoned timelines cease to exist, then you are literally destroying entire universes, complete with all the people and experiences they contain. If they continue to exist, then you are not really changing anything but merely moving between pre-existing timelines. The block universe model suggests that all timelines exist eternally in a timeless superstructure, and what we call time control is really just navigation through this structure. You cannot create or destroy timelines because they all already exist in the timeless multiverse. What you experience as rewinding or fast-forwarding is actually your consciousness moving to different locations in the multiversal structure. If this is correct, then everything that could happen does happen in some timeline, and your time control merely determines which timeline your consciousness inhabits. This has profound implications for responsibility and ethics. Are you responsible for what happens in abandoned timelines if those timelines continue to exist? Do the people in those timelines matter morally even though you have moved to a different timeline? Let us consider the ultimate question: what would be the endpoint of having time control? Where would this power ultimately lead you? One possibility is that you would eventually use time control to optimize your life to such a degree that you create a perfect timeline where everything goes as well as it possibly could. You would rewind and adjust until you find the sequence of events that maximizes happiness, success, relationships, and achievement. Once you reach this optimal timeline, you might stop using time control and simply live in the perfect reality you have created. But the concept of a perfect timeline might be illusory. No matter how good a timeline is, you could always imagine ways it could be better. You might fall into an endless loop of trying to optimize, never satisfied with any timeline because you know you could keep rewinding and trying to improve it. This would be a kind of temporal perfectionism that prevents you from ever settling down and accepting any version of reality. Moreover, what seems perfect at one moment might not seem perfect later as your values and preferences change. You might optimize for happiness in the short term, only to find that a different timeline would have led to more meaningful experiences in the long term. The very act of experiencing different timelines might change your criteria for what counts as optimal, making it impossible to ever find a final perfect timeline. Another possibility is that you would eventually become exhausted by time control and choose to give it up, returning to normal linear existence. After experiencing the disorientation of multiple timelines, the isolation of temporal manipulation, and the burden of unlimited choices, you might decide that the constraints of normal time are actually valuable. The finality of choices, the irreversibility of the past, and the uncertainty of the future might all be features rather than bugs, essential elements that give life structure and meaning. You might use time control one final time to bring yourself to a moment and timeline where you feel content, then voluntarily release your power and allow time to flow normally from that point forward. This would be a profound act of surrender, accepting limitation and finality after having experienced unlimited temporal freedom. It would be choosing meaning over power, authenticity over optimization. A third possibility is that you would use time control to transcend individual existence entirely, expanding your consciousness to encompass multiple timelines simultaneously and eventually merging with the timeless structure of reality itself. You might gradually lose your identification with any particular timeline self and instead identify with the entire branching tree of all your possible lives. This might lead to a form of temporal enlightenment where you exist simultaneously in all moments and all timelines, experiencing everything at once in a timeless, eternal now. This transcendent state might be similar to mystical experiences described in various spiritual traditions, experiences of unity with all existence, dissolution of individual ego, and awareness of timeless truth. Time control might be a path to this state, gradually expanding your temporal awareness until you break free from the limitations of individual perspective entirely. Or perhaps the endpoint would be discovering that time control was never real, that all your experiences of manipulating time were actually occurring within normal time according to the usual laws of physics. Perhaps the power to control time is itself a kind of ultimate illusion, and the journey of using it is really a journey of consciousness, exploring the nature of reality from within the usual constraints. What seems like pausing time might actually be a form of extreme meditation where your perception shifts while time continues normally. What seems like rewinding might actually be accessing parallel timelines that were always there, part of the quantum multiverse, rather than creating new ones. What seems like fast-forwarding might be quantum entanglement with your future self, receiving information from later moments without actually traveling there. The truth about time control might be that it reveals the flexibility and strangeness of consciousness itself, rather than the manipulability of external time. Your consciousness, not time, is what is really being controlled. By learning to shift your conscious perspective, you access different views of the unchanging, timeless reality, making it seem as though time is changing when really only your viewpoint is changing. In the end, the power to control time might teach you that time itself is not what you thought it was. It might reveal that the distinction between past, present, and future is less fundamental than the eternal now of pure awareness. It might show you that change and permanence, flow and stasis are complementary aspects of reality rather than contradictory ones. The journey of exploring time control, whether real or imagined, is ultimately a journey into the deepest questions about existence itself. What is time? What is consciousness? What is the relationship between them? What does it mean to have a self that persists through time or across multiple timelines? What gives life meaning when the constraints of time are removed? These questions do not have simple answers, but the thought experiment of time control makes them vivid and immediate. By imagining what it would be like to pause, rewind, fast forward, or step outside of time entirely, we gain new perspectives on the temporal nature of our existence. We see more clearly how time structures our experience, shapes our identity, and gives our lives form and meaning. As you close your eyes and prepare for sleep, you can carry with you this expanded awareness of time. Every moment you experience is precious and unique, happening only once in this timeline. The past is gone, but lives on in your memory and in its effects on the present. The future is unknown, but full of possibility. And the present moment, this breath, this heartbeat, is the only time that truly exists for you right now. You do not need the power to control time to live fully and consciously. In fact, the limitations of time, the fact that moments pass and cannot be recalled, the fact that choices have consequences that cannot be undone, the fact that the future is uncertain and must be met with courage rather than foreknowledge, these limitations are what make life meaningful and precious. Tomorrow will bring new moments, new choices, new experiences. Time will continue to flow as it always has, carrying you forward into an unknown future. And in that flow, in that surrender to the movement of time, there is a kind of freedom that no amount of temporal control could provide. the freedom to be fully present, fully human, fully alive in the unrepeatable moment that is now. The endless possibilities of time stretch before you, not as something to be controlled or manipulated, but as the very fabric of existence itself, the medium in which your life unfolds, the current that carries you forward into mystery and wonder. And in accepting this flow, in embracing the temporal nature of your existence, you find a peace deeper than any power could provide. Rest now, and let time carry you gently into sleep, into dreams, into the eternal present moment that is always now, always here, always home.